George Harrison was an English musician and singer-songwriter who achieved international fame as the lead guitarist of the Beatles. Sometimes called the Quiet Beatle, Harrison embraced Indian culture and helped broaden the scope of popular music through his incorporation of Indian instrumentation and Hindu-aligned spirituality in the Beatles' work. Although the majority of the band's songs were written by John Lennon and Paul McCartney, most Beatles albums from 1965 onwards contained at least 2 Harrison compositions. His songs for the group include Taxman, Within You Without You, While My Guitar Gently Weeps, Here Comes the Sun and Something. Harrison's earliest musical influences included George Formby and Django Reinhardt. Carl Perkins, Chet Atkins, and Chuck Berry were subsequent influences. By 1965, he had begun to lead the Beatles into folk rock through his interest in Bob Dylan and the Byrds, and towards Indian classical music through his use of Indian instruments, such as sitar, on numerous Beatles songs, starting with Norwegian Wood. Having initiated the band's embracing of transcendental meditation in 1967, he subsequently developed an association with the Hare Krishna movement. After the band's breakup in 1970, Harrison released the triple album All Things Must Pass, a critically acclaimed work that produced his most successful hit single, My Sweet Lord, and introduced his signature sound as a solo artist, the slide guitar. He also organized the 1971 concert for Bangladesh with Indian musician Ravi Shankar, a precursor to later benefit concerts such as Live Aid. In his role as a music and film producer, Harrison produced acts signed to the Beatles' Apple record label before founding Dark Horse Records in 1974. He co-founded Handmade Films in 1978, initially to produce the Monty Python Troupe's comedy film The Life of Brian. Harrison released several best-selling singles and albums as a solo performer. In 1988, he co-founded the platinum-selling supergroup The Traveling Wilburys. A prolific recording artist, he was featured as a guest guitarist on tracks by Badfinger, Ronnie Wood, and Billy Preston, and collaborated on songs and music with Dylan, Eric Clapton, Ringo Starr, and Tom Petty, among others. Rolling Stone magazine ranked him number 11 in their list of the 100 greatest guitarists of all time. He is a 2-time Rock and Roll Hall of Fame inductee as a member of the Beatles in 1988, and posthumously for his solo career in 2004. Harrison's first marriage, to model Pattie Boyd in 1966, ended in divorce in 1977. The following year he married Olivia Arias, with whom he had a son, Tanny. Harrison died from lung cancer in 2001 at the age of 58, 2 years after surviving a knife attack by an intruder at his home, Friar Park. His remains were cremated, and the ashes were scattered according to Hindu tradition in a private ceremony in the Ganges and Yamuna rivers in India. He left an estate of almost £100 million. Early years, 1943–1958. Harrison was born at 12 Arnold Grove in Wavertree, Liverpool on February 25, 1943. He was the youngest of 4 children of Harold Hargreaves Harrison and Louise. Harold was a bus conductor who had worked as a ship's steward on the White Star Line, and Louise was a shop assistant of Irish Catholic descent. He had 1 sister, Louise, and 2 brothers, Harold and Peter. According to Boyd, Harrison's mother was particularly supportive. All she wanted for her children is that they should be happy, and she recognized that nothing made George quite as happy as making music. Louise was an enthusiastic music fan, and she was known among friends for her loud singing voice, which at times startled visitors by rattling the Harrisons' windows. When Louise was pregnant with George, she often listened to the weekly broadcast Radio India. Harrison's biographer Joshua Green wrote, "Every Sunday she tuned into mystical sounds evoked by sitars and tablas, hoping that the exotic music would bring peace and calm to the baby in the womb." Harrison lived the first 4 years of his life at 12 Arnold Grove, a terraced house on a cul-de-sac. The home had an outdoor toilet and its only heat came from a single coal fire. In 1949, the family was offered a council house and moved to 25 Upton Green Spec. In 1948, at the age of 5, Harrison enrolled at Dovedale Primary School. He passed the 11+ exam and attended Liverpool Institute High School for Boys from 1954 to 1959. Though the institute did offer a music course, Harrison was disappointed with the absence of guitars, and felt the school molded into being frightened. Harrison's earliest musical influences included George Formby, Cab Calloway, Django Reinhardt, and Hoagy Carmichael. By the 1950s, Carl Perkins and Lonnie Donegan were significant influences. In early 1956, he had an epiphany. While riding his bicycle, he heard Elvis Presley's Heartbreak Hotel playing from a nearby house, and the song piqued his interest in rock and roll. He often sat at the back of the class drawing guitars in his schoolbooks, and later commented, "I was totally into guitars." Harrison cited Slim Whitman as another early influence. "The first person I ever saw playing a guitar was Slim Whitman, either a photo of him in a magazine or live on television." Guitars were definitely coming in. At first, Harold Harrison was apprehensive about his son's interest in pursuing a music career. However, in 1956, he bought George a Dutch Egmont flat-top acoustic guitar, which according to Harold, cost £3.10s. One of his father's friends taught Harrison how to play Whispering, Sweet Sue and Dinah. Inspired by Donegan's music, Harrison formed a skiffle group, the Rebels, with his brother Peter and a friend, Arthur Kelly. On the bus to school, Harrison met Paul McCartney, who also attended the Liverpool Institute, and the pair bonded over their shared love of music. The Beatles, 1958–1970. McCartney and his friend John Lennon were in a skiffle group called the Quarrymen. In March 1958, at McCartney's urging, Harrison auditioned for the Quarrymen at Rory Storm's Morgue Skiffle Club, playing Arthur Guitar Boogie Smith's Guitar Boogie Shuffle, but Lennon felt that Harrison, having just turned 15, was too young to join the band. McCartney arranged a second meeting, on the upper deck of a Liverpool bus, during which Harrison impressed Lennon by performing the lead guitar part for the instrumental Raunchy. He began socializing with the group, filling in on guitar as needed, and then became accepted as a member. Although his father wanted him to continue his education, Harrison left school at 16 and worked for several months as an apprentice electrician at Blackler's, a local department store. During the group's first tour of Scotland, in 1960, Harrison used the pseudonym Carl Harrison, in reference to Carl Perkins. In 1960, promoter Alan Williams arranged for the band, now calling themselves the Beatles, to play at the Indra and Kaisirkeler clubs in Hamburg, both owned by Bruno Koschmider. Their first residency in Hamburg ended prematurely when Harrison was deported for being too young to work in nightclubs. When Brian Epstein became their manager in December 1961, he polished up their image and later secured them a recording contract with EMI. The group's first single, Love Me Do, peaked at number 17 on the record retailer chart, and by the time their debut album, Please Please Me, was released in early 1963, Beatlemania had arrived. Often serious and focused while on stage with the band, Harrison was known as the Quiet Beatle. That moniker arose when the Beatles arrived in the United States in early 1964, and Harrison was ill with a case of strep throat and a fever and was medically advised to limit speaking as much as possible until he performed on The Ed Sullivan Show as scheduled. As such, the press noticed Harrison's apparent laconic nature in public appearances on that tour and the subsequent nickname stuck, much to Harrison's amusement. He had 2 lead vocal credits on the LP, including the Lennon-McCartney song Do You Want to Know a Secret, and 3 on their second album, with the Beatles. The latter included Don't Bother Me, Harrison's first solo writing credit. Harrison served as the Beatles' scout for new American releases, being especially knowledgeable about soul music. By 1965's Rubber Soul, he had begun to lead the other Beatles into folk rock through his interest in the Byrds and Bob Dylan, and towards Indian classical music through his use of the sitar on Norwegian Wood. He later called Rubber Soul his favorite album. Revolver included 3 of his compositions, Taxman, selected as the album's opening track, Love You to and I Want to Tell You. His drone-like tambura part on Lennon's Tomorrow Never Knows exemplified the band's ongoing exploration of non-Western instruments, while the sitar and tabla-based Love You to represented the Beatles' first genuine foray into Indian music. According to the ethnomusicologist David Reck, the latter song set a precedent in popular music as an example of Asian culture being represented by Westerners respectfully and without parody. Author Nicholas Schaffner wrote in 1978 that following Harrison's increased association with the sitar after Norwegian Wood, he became known as the Maharaja of Raga Rock. Harrison continued to develop his interest in non-Western instrumentation, playing Swarmandal on Strawberry Fields Forever. By late 1966, Harrison's interests had moved away from the Beatles. This was reflected in his choice of Eastern gurus and religious leaders for inclusion on the album cover for Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band in 1967. His sole composition on the album was the Indian-inspired Within You Without You, to which no other Beatle contributed. He played sitar and tambura on the track, backed by musicians from the London Asian Music Circle on Dilruba, Swarmandal, and tabla. He later commented on the Sgt. Pepper album, "It was a millstone and a milestone in the music industry. There's about half the songs I like and the other half I can't stand." In January 1968, he recorded the basic track for his song The Inner Light at Emmy's studio in Bombay, using a group of local musicians playing traditional Indian instruments. Released as the B-side to McCartney's Lady Madonna, it was the first Harrison composition to appear on a Beatles single. Derived from a quotation from the Tao Te Ching, the song's lyric reflected Harrison's deepening interest in Hinduism and meditation. During the recording of the Beatles that same year, tensions within the group ran high, and drummer Ringo Starr quit briefly. Harrison's 4 songwriter contributions to the double album included While My Guitar Gently Weeps, which featured Eric Clapton on lead guitar, and the horn-driven Savoy Truffle. Dylan and the band were a major musical influence on Harrison at the end of his career with the Beatles. While on a visit to Woodstock in late 1968, he established a friendship with Dylan and found himself drawn to the band's sense of communal music making and to the creative equality among the band members, which contrasted with Lennon and McCartney's domination of the Beatles' songwriter and creative direction. This coincided with a prolific period in his songwriter and a growing desire to assert his independence from the Beatles. Tensions among the group surfaced again in January 1969, at Twickenham Studios, during the filmed rehearsals that became the 1970 documentary Let It Be. Frustrated by the cold and sterile film studio, by Lennon's creative disengagement from the Beatles, and by what he perceived as a domineering attitude from McCartney, Harrison quit the group on January 10. He returned 12 days later, after his bandmates had agreed to move the film project to their own Apple studio and to abandon McCartney's plan for making a return to public performance. Relations among the Beatles were more cordial, though still strained, when the band recorded their 1969 album Abbey Road. The LP included what Lavette Soley describes as 2 classic contributions from Harrison: Here Comes the Sun and Something That Saw Him finally achieve equal songwriter status with Lennon and McCartney. During the album's recording, Harrison asserted more creative control than before, rejecting suggestions for changes to his music, particularly from McCartney. Something became his first A-side when issued on a double A-side single with Come Together. The song was number 1 in Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and West Germany, and the combined sides topped the Billboard Hot 100 chart in the United States. In the 1970s, Frank Sinatra recorded Something twice and later dubbed it the greatest love song of the past 50 years. Lennon considered it the best song on Abbey Road, and it became the Beatles' second most covered song after Yesterday. In May 1970, Harrison's song For You Blue was coupled on a US single with McCartney's The Long and Winding Road and became Harrison's second chart topper when the sides were listed together at number 1 on the Hot 100. His increased productivity meant that by the time of their breakup he had amassed a stockpile of unreleased compositions. While Harrison grew as a songwriter, his compositional presence on Beatles albums remained limited to 2 or 3 songs, increasing his frustration, and significantly contributing to the band's breakup. Harrison's last recording session with the Beatles was on January 4, 1970, when he, McCartney and Starr recorded his song I Me Mine for the Let It Be soundtrack album. Solo career, 1968–1987. Early solo work, 1968–1969. Before the Beatles' breakup, Harrison had already recorded and released 2 solo albums, Wonderwall Music and Electronic Sound, both of which contain mainly instrumental compositions. Wonderwall Music, a soundtrack to the 1968 film Wonderwall, blends Indian and Western instrumentation, while Electronic Sound is an experimental album that prominently features a Moog synthesizer. Released in November 1968, Wonderwall Music was the first solo album by a Beatle and the first LP released by Apple Records. Indian musicians Ashish Khan and Shivkumar Sharma performed on the album, which contains the experimental sound collage Dream Scene, recorded several months before Lennon's Revolution 9. In December 1969, Harrison participated in a brief tour of Europe with the American group Delaney and Bonnie and Friends. During the tour that included Clapton, Bobby Whitlock, drummer Jim Gordon and band leaders Delaney and Bonnie Bramlett, Harrison began to play slide guitar, and also began to write My Sweet Lord, which became his first single as a solo artist. All Things Must Pass / I, 1970. None. The Concert for Bangladesh, 1971. Harrison responded to a request from Ravi Shankar by organizing a charity event, the Concert for Bangladesh, which took place on August 1, 1971. The event drew over 40,000 people to 2 shows in New York's Madison Square Garden. The goal of the event was to raise money to aid starving refugees during the Bangladesh Liberation War. Shankar opened the show, which featured popular musicians such as Dylan, Clapton, Leon Russell, Badfinger, Preston, and Starr. A triple album, The Concert for Bangladesh, was released by Apple in December, followed by a concert film in 1972. Credited to George Harrison and Friends, the album topped the UK chart and peaked at number 2 in the US, and went on to win the Grammy Award for Album of the Year. Tax troubles and questionable expenses later tied up many of the proceeds, but Harrison commented, mainly the concert was to attract attention to the situation. The money we raised was secondary, and although we had some money problems, they still got plenty, even though it was a drop in the ocean. The main thing was, we spread the word and helped get the war ended. Living in the Material World /I to I George Harrison /I, 1973–1979. None. I Somewhere in England /I to I Cloud9 /I, 1980–1987. None. Later career, 1988–1996. The Traveling Wilburys and Return to Touring, 1988–1992. In 1988, Harrison formed the Traveling Wilburys with Jeff Lynne, Roy Orbison, Bob Dylan, and Tom Petty. The band had gathered in Dylan's garage to record a song for a Harrison European single release. Harrison's record company decided the track, Handle with Care, was too good for its original purpose as a B-side and asked for a full album. The LP, Traveling Wilburys Volume 1, was released in October 1988 and recorded under pseudonyms as half-brothers, supposed sons of Charles Truscott Wilbury, sister. It reached number 16 in the UK and number 3 in the US, where it was certified triple platinum. Harrison's pseudonym on the album was Nelson Wilbury. He used the name Spike Wilbury for their second album. In 1989, Harrison and Starr appeared in the music video for Petty's song I Won't Back Down. In October that year, Harrison assembled and released Best of Dark Horse 1976-1989, a compilation of his later solo work. The album included 3 new songs, including Cheer Down, which Harrison had recently contributed to the Lethal Weapon 2 film soundtrack. Following Orbison's death in December 1988, the Wilburys recorded as a 4-piece. Their second album, issued in October 1990, was mischievously titled Traveling Wilburys Volume 3. According to Lynn, that was George's idea. He said, "Let's confuse the buggers." It peaked at number 14 in the UK and number 11 in the US, where it was certified platinum. The Wilburys never performed live, and the group did not record together again following the release of their second album. In December 1991, Harrison joined Clapton for a tour of Japan. It was Harrison's first since 1974 and no others followed. On April 6, 1992, Harrison held a benefit concert for the Natural Law Party at the Royal Albert Hall, his first London performance since the Beatles' 1969 rooftop concert. In October 1992, he performed at a Bob Dylan tribute concert at Madison Square Garden in New York City, playing alongside Dylan, Clapton, McGuinn, Petty, and Neil Young. The Beatles Anthology /I, 1994-1996. None. Later Life and Death, 1997-2001. After the anthology project, Harrison collaborated with Ravi Shankar on the latter's Chants of India. Harrison's final television appearance was a VH1 special to promote the album, taped in May 1997. Soon afterwards, Harrison was diagnosed with throat cancer. He was treated with radiotherapy, which was thought at the time to be successful. He publicly blamed years of smoking for the illness. In January 1998, Harrison attended Carl Perkins' funeral in Jackson, Tennessee, where he performed a brief rendition of Perkins' song Your True Love. In May, he represented the Beatles at London's High Court in their successful bid to gain control of unauthorized recordings made of a 1962 performance by the band at the Star Club in Hamburg. The following year, he was the most active of the former Beatles in promoting the reissue of their 1968 animated film Yellow Submarine. On December 30, 1999, Harrison and his wife Olivia were attacked at their home, Friar Park. Michael Abram, a 34-year-old man suffering from paranoid schizophrenia, broke in and attacked Harrison with a kitchen knife, puncturing a lung and causing head injuries before his wife incapacitated the assailant by striking him repeatedly with a fireplace poker and a lamp. Harrison later commented, "I felt exhausted and could feel the strength draining from me. I vividly remember a deliberate thrust to my chest. I could hear my lung exhaling and had blood in my mouth. I believed I had been fatally stabbed." Following the attack, Harrison was hospitalized with more than 40 stab wounds, and part of his punctured lung was removed. He released a statement soon afterwards regarding his assailant: "He wasn't a burglar, and he certainly wasn't auditioning for the Traveling Wilburys." Adi Shankara, an Indian historical, spiritual, and groovy type person, once said, "Life is fragile like a raindrop on a lotus leaf. And you'd better believe it." Upon being released from a mental hospital in 2002 after less than 3 years in state custody, Abram said, "If I could turn back the clock, I would give anything not to have done what I did in attacking George Harrison, but looking back on it now, I have come to understand that I was at the time not in control of my actions. I can only hope the Harrison family might somehow find it in their hearts to accept my apologies. The injuries inflicted on Harrison during the home invasion were downplayed by his family in their comments to the press. Having seen Harrison looking so healthy beforehand, those in his social circle believed that the attack brought about a change in him and was the cause for his cancer's return. In May 2001, it was revealed that Harrison had undergone an operation to remove a cancerous growth from one of his lungs, and in July, it was reported that he was being treated for a brain tumor at a clinic in Switzerland. While in Switzerland, Starr visited him but had to cut short his stay to travel to Boston, where his daughter was undergoing emergency brain surgery. Harrison, who was very weak, quipped, "Do you want me to come with you?" In November 2001, he began radiotherapy at Staten Island University Hospital in New York City for non-small cell lung cancer that had spread to his brain. When the news was made public, Harrison bemoaned his physician's breach of privacy, and his estate later claimed damages. On November 29, 2001, Harrison died at a property belonging to McCartney, on Heather Road in Beverly Hills, Los Angeles. He was 58 years old. He died in the company of Olivia, Dhani, Shankar, and the latter's wife Sukanya and daughter Anushka, and Hare Krishna devotees Shyamasundar Das and Mukunda Goswami, who chanted verses from the Bhagavad Gita. His final message to the world, as relayed in a statement by Olivia and Dhani, was, "Everything else can wait, but the search for God cannot wait, and love one another." He was cremated at Hollywood Forever Cemetery and his funeral was held at the Self-Realization Fellowship Lake Shrine in Pacific Palisades, California. His close family scattered his ashes according to Hindu tradition in a private ceremony in the Ganges and Yamuna rivers near Varanasi, India. He left almost £100 million in his will. Harrison's final studio album, Brainwashed, was released posthumously after it was completed by his son Dhani and Jeff Lynne. A quotation from the Bhagavad Gita is included in the album's liner notes, "There never was a time when you or I did not exist. Nor will there be any future when we shall cease to be." A media-only single, Stuck Inside a Cloud, which Lang describes as a uniquely candid reaction to illness and mortality, achieved number 27 on Billboard's Adult Contemporary chart. The single Any Road, released in May 2003, peaked at number 37 on the UK singles chart. Marwa Blues went on to receive the 2004 Grammy Award for Best Pop Instrumental Performance, while Any Road was nominated for Best Male Pop Vocal Performance. Musicianship. Guitar work. Harrison's guitar work with the Beatles was varied and flexible. Although not fast or flashy, his lead guitar playing was solid and typified the more subdued lead guitar style of the early 1960s. His rhythm guitar playing was innovative, for example when he used a capo to shorten the strings on an acoustic guitar, as on the Rubber Soul album and Here Comes the Sun, to create a bright, sweet sound. Eric Clapton felt that Harrison was clearly an innovator as he was taking certain elements of R&B and rockabilly and creating something unique. Rolling Stone founder Jan Wenner described Harrison as a guitarist who was never showy but who had an innate, eloquent melodic sense. He played exquisitely in the service of the song. The guitar-picking style of Chet Atkins and Carl Perkins influenced Harrison, giving a country music feel to many of the Beatles' recordings. He identified Chuck Berry as another early influence. In 1961, the Beatles recorded Cry for a Shadow, a blues-inspired instrumental CO written by Lennon and Harrison, who is credited with composing the song's lead guitar part, building on unusual chord voicings and imitating the style of other English groups such as the Shadows. Harrison's liberal use of the diatonic scale in his guitar playing reveals the influence of Buddy Holly, and his interest in Barry inspired him to compose songs based on the blues scale while incorporating a rockabilly feel in the style of Perkins. Another of Harrison's musical techniques was the use of guitar lines written in octaves, as on I'll Be on My Way. By 1964, he had begun to develop a distinctive personal style as a guitarist, writing parts that featured the use of non-resolving tones, as with the ending chord arpeggios on A Hard Day's Night. On this and other songs from the period, he used a Rickenbacker 360/12 an electric guitar with 12 strings, the low 8 of which are tuned in pairs, 1 octave apart, with the higher 4 being pairs tuned in unison. His use of the Rickenbacker on A Hard Day's Night helped to popularize the model, and the jangly sound became so prominent that Melody Maker termed it the Beatles' secret weapon. In 1965, Harrison used an expression pedal to control his guitar's volume on I Need You, creating a syncopated flautando effect with the melody resolving its dissonance through tonal displacements. He used the same volume swell technique on Yes It Is, applying whatever it described as ghostly articulation to the song's natural harmonics. In 1966, Harrison contributed innovative musical ideas to Revolver. He played backwards guitar on Lennon's composition I'm Only Sleeping and a guitar countermelody on And Your Bird Can Sing that moved in parallel octaves above McCartney's bass downbeats. His guitar playing on I Want to Tell You exemplified the pairing of altered chordal colors with descending chromatic lines, and his guitar part for Sgt. Pepper's Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds mirrors Lennon's vocal line in much the same way that a sarangi player accompanies a khyal singer in a Hindu devotional song. Everett described Harrison's guitar solo from Old Brown Shoe as stinging, highly Clapton-esque. He identified two of the composition's significant motifs, a bluesy trichord and a diminished triad with roots in A and E. Huntley called the song a sizzling rocker with a ferocious solo. In Green's opinion, Harrison's demo for Old Brown Shoe contains one of the most complex lead guitar solos on any Beatles song. Harrison's playing on Abbey Road, and in particular on Something, marked a significant moment in his development as a guitarist. The song's guitar solo shows a varied range of influences, incorporating the blues guitar style of Clapton and the styles of Indian gamakas. According to author and musicologist Kenneth Womack, Something meanders toward the most unforgettable of Harrison's guitar solos. A masterpiece in simplicity, reaches toward the sublime. After Delaney Bramlett inspired him to learn slide guitar, Harrison began to incorporate it into his solo work, which allowed him to mimic many traditional Indian instruments, including the sarangi and the dilruba. Lang described Harrison's slide guitar solo on Lennon's How Do You Sleep as a departure for the sweet soloist of Something, calling his playing rightly famed, one of Harrison's greatest guitar statements. Lennon commented, "That's the best he's ever fucking played in his life." A Hawaiian influence is notable in much of Harrison's music, ranging from his slide guitar work on Gone Troppo to his televised performance of the Cab Calloway standard Between the Devil and the Deep Blue Sea on ukulele in 1992. Lavette Soli described Harrison's slide playing on the Grammy-winning instrumental Marwa Blues as demonstrating Hawaiian influences while comparing the melody to an Indian sarod or veena, calling it yet another demonstration of Harrison's unique slide approach. Harrison was an admirer of George Formby and a member of the Ukulele Society of Great Britain, and played a ukulele solo in the style of Formby at the end of Free as a Bird. He performed at a Formby convention in 1991, and served as the honorary president of the George Formby Appreciation Society. Harrison played bass guitar on a few tracks, including the Beatles songs She Said, Golden Slumbers, Birthday and Honey Pie. He also played bass on several solo recordings, including Faster, Wake Up My Love and Bye Bye Love. Sitar and Indian music. During the Beatles' American tour in August 1965, Harrison's friend David Crosby of the Byrds introduced him to Indian classical music and the work of sitar maestro Ravi Shankar. Harrison described Shankar as the first person who ever impressed me in my life, and he was the only person who didn't try to impress me. Harrison became fascinated with the sitar and immersed himself in Indian music. According to Lavette Soley, Harrison's introduction of the instrument on the Beatles' song Norwegian Wood opened the floodgates for Indian instrumentation in rock music, triggering what Shankar would call the Great Sitar Explosion of 1966–67. Lavette Soley recognizes Harrison as the man most responsible for this phenomenon. In June 1966, Harrison met Shankar at the home of Mrs. Angadi of the Asian Music Circle, asked to be his student, and was accepted. Before this meeting, Harrison had recorded his Revolver track Love You To, contributing a sitar part that Lavette Soley describes as an astonishing improvement over Norwegian Wood and the most accomplished performance on sitar by any rock musician. On July 6, Harrison travelled to India to buy a sitar from Ricky Ram and Sons in New Delhi. In September, following the Beatles' final tour, he returned to India to study sitar for 6 weeks with Shankar. He initially stayed in Bombay until fans learned of his arrival, then moved to a houseboat on a remote lake in Kashmir. During this visit, he also received tutelage from Shamhu Das, Shankar's protégé. Harrison studied the instrument until 1968, when, following a discussion with Shankar about the need to find his roots, an encounter with Clapton and Jimi Hendrix at a hotel in New York convinced him to return to guitar playing. Harrison commented, "I decided I'm not going to be a great sitar player, because I should have started at least 15 years earlier." Harrison continued to use Indian instrumentation occasionally on his solo albums and remained strongly associated with the genre. Lavette Soley groups him with Paul Simon and Peter Gabriel as the three rock musicians who have given the most mainstream exposure to non-Western musics, or the concept of world music. Songwriter. Harrison wrote his first song, Don't Bother Me, while sick in a hotel bed in Bournemouth during August 1963, as an exercise to see if I could write a song, as he remembered. His songwriter ability improved throughout the Beatles' career, but his material did not earn full respect from Lennon, McCartney, and producer George Martin until near the group's breakup. In 1969, McCartney told Lennon, "Until this year, our songs have been better than George's. Now this year his songs are at least as good as ours." Harrison often had difficulty getting the band to record his songs. Most Beatles albums from 1965 onwards contain at least 2 Harrison compositions. 3 of his songs appear on Revolver, the album on which Harrison came of age as a songwriter, according to Inglis. Harrison wrote the chord progression of Don't Bother Me almost exclusively in the Dorian mode, demonstrating an interest in exotic tones that eventually culminated in his embrace of Indian music. The latter proved a strong influence on his songwriter and contributed to his innovation within the Beatles. According to Michael Gilmore of Rolling Stone, Harrison's openness to new sounds and textures cleared new paths for his rock and roll compositions. His use of dissonance on Taxman and I Want to Tell You was revolutionary in popular music and perhaps more originally creative than the avant-garde mannerisms that Lennon and McCartney borrowed from the music of Karl-Heinz Stockhausen, Luciano Berio, Edgar Varese, and Igor Stravinsky. Of the 1967 Harrison song Within You Without You, author Gary Farrell said that Harrison had created a new form, calling the composition a quintessential fusion of pop and Indian music. Lennon called the song one of Harrison's best. His mind and his music are clear. There is his innate talent, he brought that sound together. In his next fully Indian-styled song, The Inner Light, Harrison embraced the Carnatic discipline of Indian music, rather than the Hindustani style he had used in Love You to End Within You Without You. Writing in 1997, Farrell commented, "It is a mark of Harrison's sincere involvement with Indian music that, nearly 30 years on, the Beatles' Indian songs remain the most imaginative and successful examples of this type of fusion, for example, Blue Jay Way and The Inner Light. Beatles biographer Bob Spitz described Something as a masterpiece, and an intensely stirring romantic ballad that would challenge Yesterday and Michelle as one of the most recognizable songs they ever produced. Inglis considered Abbey Road a turning point in Harrison's development as a songwriter and musician. He described Harrison's two contributions to the LP, Here Comes the Sun and Something, as exquisite, declaring them equal to any previous Beatles songs. Collaborations. From 1968 onwards, Harrison collaborated with other musicians. He brought in Eric Clapton to play lead guitar on While My Guitar Gently Weeps for the 1968 Beatles' White Album, and collaborated with John Barham on his 1968 debut solo album, Wonderwall Music, which included contributions from Clapton again, as well as Peter Tork from the Monkees. He played on tracks by Dave Mason, Nicky Hopkins, Alvin Lee, Ronnie Wood, Billy Preston, and Tom Scott. Harrison co-wrote songs and music with Dylan, Clapton, Preston, Doris Troy, David Bromberg, Gary Wright, Wood, Jeff Lynne, and Tom Petty, among others. Harrison's music projects during the final years of the Beatles included producing Apple Records artists Doris Troy, Jackie Lomax, and Billy Preston. Harrison co-wrote the song Badge with Clapton, which was included on Cream's 1969 album, Goodbye. Harrison played rhythm guitar on the track, using the pseudonym El Angelo Misterioso for contractual reasons. In May 1970, he played guitar on several songs during a recording session for Dylan's album New Morning. Between 1971 and 1973, he co-wrote and/or produced 3 top 10 hits for Star, It Don't Come Easy, Back Off Boogaloo and Photograph. Aside from How Do You Sleep, his contributions to Lennon's 1971 album Imagine included a slide guitar solo on Gimme Some Truth and dobro on Crippled Inside. Also that year, he produced and played slide guitar on Badfinger's top 10 hit Day After Day, and a dobro on Preston's I Wrote a Simple Song. He worked with Harry Nilsson on You're Breakin' My Heart and with Cheech and Chong on Basketball Jones. In 1974, Harrison founded Dark Horse Records as an avenue for collaboration with other musicians. He wanted Dark Horse to serve as a creative outlet for artists, as Apple Records had for the Beatles. Eric Idle commented, "He's extremely generous, and he backs and supports all sorts of people that you'll never, ever hear of." The first acts signed to the new label were Ravi Shankar and the duo Splinter. Harrison produced and made multiple musical contributions to Splinter's debut album, The Place I Love, which provided Dark Horse with its first hit, Cost a Fine Town. He also produced and played guitar and autoharp on Shankar's Shankar Family and Friends, the label's other inaugural release. Other artists signed by Dark Horse include Attitudes, Henry McCullough, Jiva, and Stairsteps. Harrison collaborated with Tom Scott on Scott's 1975 album New York Connection, and in 1981 he played guitar on Walk a Thin Line, from Mick Fleetwood's The Visitor. His contributions to Starr's solo career continued with Rack My Brain, a 1981 US Top 40 hit written and produced by Harrison, and guitar overdubs to 2 tracks on Vertical Man. In 1996, Harrison recorded Distance Makes No Difference with Love with Carl Perkins for the latter's album Go Cat Go, and, in 1990, he played slide guitar on the title track of Dylan's Under the Red Sky album. In 2001, he performed as a guest musician on Jeff Lynne and Electric Light Orchestra's comeback album Zoom, and on the song Love Letters for Bill Wyman's Rhythm Kings. He also co-wrote a new song with his son Dhani, Horse to the Water, which was recorded on October 2, 8 weeks before his death. It appeared on Jools Holland's album Small World, Big Band. Guitars. When Harrison joined the Quarrymen in 1958, his main guitar was a Hofner President acoustic, which he soon traded for a Hofner Club 40 model. His first solid-body electric guitar was a Czech-built Jolana Futurama/Grazioso. The guitars he used on early recordings were mainly Gretsch models, played through a Vox amplifier, including a Gretsch Duojet that he bought second-hand in 1961 and posed with on the album cover for Cloud 9. He also bought a Gretsch Tennessean and a Gretsch Country Gentleman, which he played on She Loves You, and during the Beatles' 1964 appearance on The Ed Sullivan Show. In 1963, he bought a Rickenbacker 425 Fireglow, and in 1964 he acquired a Rickenbacker 360/12 guitar, which was the second of its kind to be manufactured. Harrison obtained his first Fender Stratocaster in 1965 and first used it during the recording of the Help album that February. He also used it when recording Rubber Soul later that year, most notably on the song Nowhere Man. In early 1966, Harrison and Lennon each purchased Epiphone Casinos, which they used on Revolver. Harrison also used a Gibson J160E and a Gibson SG Standard while recording the album. He later painted his Stratocaster in a psychedelic design that included the word Bebopalula above the pickguard and the guitar's nickname, Rocky, on the headstock. He played this guitar in the Magical Mystery Tour film and throughout his solo career. In July 1968, Clapton gave him a Gibson Les Paul that had been stripped of its original finish and stained cherry red, which Harrison nicknamed Lucy. Around this time, he obtained a Gibson Jumbo J200 acoustic guitar, which he subsequently gave to Dylan to use at the 1969 Isle of Wight Festival. In late 1968, Fender Musical Instruments Corporation gave Harrison a custom-made Fender Telecaster Rosewood prototype, made especially for him by Philip Kubicki. In August 2017, Fender released a limited edition George Harrison Rosewood Telecaster modeled after a Telecaster that Roger Rossmile originally created for Harrison. Film production and handmade films. Harrison helped finance Ravi Shankar's documentary Raga and released it through Apple Films in 1971. He also produced, with Apple manager Alan Klein, the concert for Bangladesh film. In 1973, he produced the feature film Little Malcolm, but the project was lost amid the litigation surrounding the former Beatles ending their business ties with Klein. In 1973, Peter Sellers introduced Harrison to Dennis O'Brien. Soon after, the two went into business together. In 1978, to produce Monty Python's Life of Brian, they formed the film production and distribution company Handmade Films. Their opportunity for investment came after EMI Films withdrew funding at the demand of their chief executive, Bernard Delfont. Harrison financed the production of Life of Brian in part by mortgaging his home, which Idol later called the most anybody's ever paid for a cinema ticket in history. The film grossed $21 million at the box office in the U.S. The first film distributed by Handmade Films was The Long Good Friday, and the first they produced was Time Bandits, a CO-scripted project by Monty Python's Terry Gilliam and Michael Palin. The film featured a new song by Harrison, Dream Away, in the closing credits. Time Bandits became one of Handmade's most successful and acclaimed efforts. With a budget of $5 million, it earned $35 million in the U.S. within 10 weeks of its release. Harrison served as executive producer for 23 films with Handmade, including A Private Function, Mona Lisa, Shanghai Surprise, With Nail, and I and How to Get Ahead in Advertising. He made cameo appearances in several of these films, including a role as a nightclub singer in Shanghai Surprise, for which he recorded 5 new songs. According to Ian Inglis, executive role in Handmade Films helped to sustain British cinema at a time of crisis, producing some of the country's most memorable movies of the 1980s. Following a series of box office bombs in the late 1980s, and excessive debt incurred by O'Brien which was guaranteed by Harrison, Handmaid's financial situation became precarious. The company ceased operations in 1991 and was sold 3 years later to Paragon Entertainment, a Canadian corporation. Afterwards, Harrison sued O'Brien for $25 million for fraud and negligence, resulting in an $11.6 million judgment in 1996. Humanitarian work. Harrison was involved in humanitarian and political activism throughout his life. In the 1960s, the Beatles supported the civil rights movement and protested against the Vietnam War. In early 1971, Ravi Shankar consulted Harrison about how to provide aid to the people of Bangladesh after the 1970 Bola cyclone and the Bangladesh Liberation War. Harrison hastily wrote and recorded the song Bangladesh, which became pop music's first charity single when issued by Apple Records in late July. He also pushed Apple to release Shankar's Joy Bangla EP in an effort to raise further awareness for the cause. Shankar asked for Harrison's advice about planning a small charity event in the U.S. Harrison responded by organizing the Concert for Bangladesh, which raised more than $240,000. Around $13.5 million was generated through the album and film releases, although most of the funds were frozen in an Internal Revenue Service audit for 10 years, due to Klein's failure to register the event as a UNICEF benefit beforehand. In June 1972, UNICEF honored Harrison and Shankar, and Klein, with the Child is the Father of Man award at an annual ceremony in recognition of their fundraising efforts for Bangladesh. From 1980, Harrison became a vocal supporter of Greenpeace and CND. He also protested against the use of nuclear energy with Friends of the Earth, and helped finance Vol, a green magazine launched by Monty Python member Terry Jones. In 1990, he helped promote his wife Olivia's Romanian Angel Appeal on behalf of the thousands of Romanian orphans left abandoned by the state following the fall of communism in Eastern Europe. Harrison recorded a benefit single, Nobody's Child, with the Traveling Wilburys, and assembled a fundraising album with contributions from other artists including Clapton, Starr, Elton John, Stevie Wonder, Donovan and Van Morrison. The Concert for Bangladesh has been described as an innovative precursor for the large-scale charity rock shows that followed, including Live Aid. The George Harrison Humanitarian Fund for UNICEF, a joint effort between the Harrison family and the U.S. Fund for UNICEF, aims to support programs that help children caught in humanitarian emergencies. In December 2007, they donated $450,000 to help the victims of Cyclone Sidra in Bangladesh. On October 13, 2009, the first George Harrison Humanitarian Award went to Ravi Shankar for his efforts in saving the lives of children, and his involvement with the Concert for Bangladesh. Personal life. Hinduism. By the mid-1960s, Harrison had become an admirer of Indian culture and mysticism, introducing it to the other Beatles. During the filming of Help! In the Bahamas, they met the founder of Sivananda Yoga, Swami Vishnu Devananda, who gave each of them a signed copy of his book, The Complete Illustrated Book of Yoga. Between the end of the last Beatles tour in 1966 and the beginning of the Sgt. Pepper recording sessions, he made a pilgrimage to India with his first wife, Pattie Boyd. There, he studied sitar with Ravi Shankar, met several gurus, and visited various holy places. In 1968, he travelled with the other Beatles to Rishikesh in northern India to study meditation with Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. Harrison's experiences with LSD in the mid-1960s served as a catalyst for his early pursuance of Hinduism. In a 1977 interview, George recalled, "For me, it was like a flash. The first time I had acid, it just opened up something in my head that was inside of me, and I realized a lot of things. I didn't learn them because I already knew them, but that happened to be the key that opened the door to reveal them." From the moment I had that, I wanted to have it all the time, these thoughts about the yogis and the Himalayas, and Ravi's music. However, Harrison stopped using LSD after a disenchanting experience in San Francisco's Haight-Ashbury neighborhood, recounting in Anthology. That was the turning point for me. That's when I went right off the whole drug cult and stopped taking the dreaded lysergic acid. I had some in a little bottle. It was liquid. I put it under a microscope, and it looked like bits of old rope. I thought that I couldn't put that into my brain anymore. In line with the Hindu yoga tradition, Harrison became a vegetarian in the late 1960s. After being given various religious texts by Shankar in 1966, he remained a lifelong advocate of the teachings of Swami Vivekananda and Paramahansa Yogananda, yogis and authors, respectively, of Raja Yoga and Autobiography of a Yogi. In mid-1969, he produced the single Hare Krishna mantra, performed by members of the London Radha Krishna Temple. Having also helped the temple devotees become established in Britain, Harrison then met their leader, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada, whom he described as my friend, my master and a perfect example of everything he preached. Harrison embraced the Hare Krishna tradition, particularly japa yoga chanting with beads, and became a lifelong devotee. In 1972 he donated his Lechmore Heath mansion north of London to the devotees. It was later converted to a temple and renamed Bhaktivedanta Manor. Regarding other faiths, he once remarked, "All religions are branches of one big tree. It doesn't matter what you call him just as long as you call." He commented on his beliefs. Krishna actually was in a body as a person. What makes it complicated is, if he's God, what's he doing fighting on a battlefield? It took me ages to try to figure that out, and again it was Yogananda's spiritual interpretation of the Bhagavad Gita that made me realize what it was. Our idea of Krishna and Arjuna on the battlefield in the chariot. So this is the point, that we're in these bodies, which is like a kind of chariot, and we're going through this incarnation, this life, which is kind of a battlefield. The senses of the body are the horses pulling the chariot, and we have to get control over the chariot by getting control over the reins. And Arjuna in the end says, "Please Krishna, you drive the chariot, because unless we bring Christ or Krishna or Buddha or whichever of our spiritual guides, we're going to crash our chariot, and we're going to turn over, and we're going to get killed in the battlefield." That's why we say Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, asking Krishna to come and take over the chariot. Family and interests. Harrison married model Pattie Boyd on January 21, 1966, with McCartney serving as best man. Harrison and Boyd had met on set in 1964 during the production of the film A Hard Day's Night, in which the 19-year-old Boyd had been cast as a schoolgirl. During lunch, George playfully proposed to her. They separated in 1974 and their divorce was finalized in 1977. Boyd said her decision to end the marriage was due largely to George's repeated infidelities. The last infidelity culminated in an affair with Ringo's wife Maureen, which Boyd called the final straw. She characterized the last year of their marriage as fueled by alcohol and cocaine, and she stated, "George used coke excessively, and I think it changed him, it froze his emotions and hardened his heart." She subsequently moved in with Eric Clapton, and they married in 1979. Harrison married A&M, and later Dark Horse Records, marketing executive Olivia Trinidad Arias on September 2, 1978. As Dark Horse was a subsidiary of A&M, the couple had first met over the phone working on record company business, and then in person at the A&M Records offices in Los Angeles in 1974. Together they had one son, Tanny Harrison, born on August 1, 1978. Harrison restored the English manor house and grounds of Friar Park, his home in Henley-on-Thames, where several of his music videos, including Crackerbox Palace, were filmed. The grounds also served as the background for the cover of All Things Must Pass. He employed 10 workers to maintain the 36-acre garden. Harrison commented on gardening as a form of escapism. "Sometimes I feel like I'm actually on the wrong planet, and it's great when I'm in my garden, but the minute I go out the gate I think, what the hell am I doing here?" His autobiography, I, Me, Mine, is dedicated to gardeners everywhere. The former Beatles publicist Derek Taylor helped Harrison write the book, which said little about the Beatles, focusing instead on Harrison's hobbies, music, and lyrics. Taylor commented, "George is not disowning the Beatles, but it was a long time ago and actually a short part of his life." Harrison had an interest in sports cars and motor racing. He was one of the 100 people who purchased the McLaren F1 road car. He had collected photos of racing drivers and their cars since he was young. At 12, he had attended his first race, the 1955 British Grand Prix at Aintree. He wrote Faster as a tribute to the Formula One racing drivers Jackie Stewart and Ronnie Peterson. Proceeds from its release went to the Gunnar Nilsson Cancer Charity, set up after the Swedish driver's death from the disease in 1978. Harrison's first extravagant car, a 1964 Aston Martin DB5, was sold at auction on December 7, 2011 in London. An anonymous Beatles collector paid £350,000 for the vehicle that Harrison had bought new in January 1965. Relationships with the other Beatles. For most of the Beatles' career, the relationships in the group were close. According to Hunter Davies, the Beatles spent their lives not living a communal life, but communally living the same life. They were each other's greatest friends. Harrison's ex-wife Pattie Boyd described how the Beatles all belonged to each other and admitted, "George has a lot with the others that I can never know about. Nobody, not even the wives, can break through or even comprehend it." Starr said, "We really looked out for each other and we had so many laughs together. In the old days we'd have the biggest hotel suites, the whole floor of the hotel, and the 4 of us would end up in the bathroom, just to be with each other." He added, "There were some really loving, caring moments between 4 people, a hotel room here and there, a really amazing closeness. Just 4 guys who loved each other. It was pretty sensational." Lennon stated that his relationship with Harrison was one of young follower and older guy, "was like a disciple of mine when we started." The two later bonded over their LSD experiences, finding common ground as seekers of spirituality. They took radically different paths thereafter, with, according to biographer Gary Tillery, Harrison finding God and Lennon coming to the conclusion that people are the creators of their own lives. In 1974, Harrison said of his former bandmate, "John Lennon is a saint and he's heavy-duty, and he's great and I love him. But at the same time, he's such a bastard, but that's the great thing about him, you see." Harrison and McCartney were the first of the Beatles to meet, having shared a school bus, and often learned and rehearsed new guitar chords together. McCartney said that he and Harrison usually shared a bedroom while touring. McCartney has referred to Harrison as his baby brother. In a 1974 BBC radio interview with Alan Freeman, Harrison stated, "Ruined me as a guitar player." In the same interview, however, Harrison stated that "I just know that whatever we've been through, there's always been something that's tied us together." Perhaps the most significant obstacle to a Beatles reunion after the death of Lennon was Harrison and McCartney's personal relationship, as both men admitted that they often got on each other's nerves. Rodriguez commented, "Even to the end of George's days, theirs was a volatile relationship." When, in a Yahoo online chat in February 2001, he was asked if Paul you off, Harrison replied, "Scan not a friend with a microscopic glass, you know his faults then let his foibles pass." Old Victorian proverb. I'm sure there's enough about me that pisses him off, but I think we have now grown old enough to realize that we're both pretty damn cute. Legacy. In June 1965, Harrison and the other Beatles were appointed members of the Order of the British Empire. They received their insignia from the Queen at an investiture at Buckingham Palace on October 26. In 1971, the Beatles received an Academy Award for the Best Original Song Score for the film Let It Be. The minor planet 4149 Harrison, discovered in 1984, was named after him, as was a variety of dahlia flower. In December 1992, he became the first recipient of the Billboard Century Award, an honor presented to music artists for significant bodies of work. The award recognized Harrison's critical role in laying the groundwork for the modern concept of world music and for his having advanced society's comprehension of the spiritual and altruistic power of popular music. Rolling Stone magazine ranked him number 11 in their list of the 100 greatest guitarists of all time. He is also in number 65 in the list of 100 greatest songwriters of all time by the same magazine. In 2002, on the first anniversary of his death, the concert for George was held at the Royal Albert Hall. Eric Clapton organized the event, which included performances by many of Harrison's friends and musical collaborators, including McCartney and Starr. Eric Idle, who described Harrison as one of the few morally good people that rock and roll has produced, was among the performers of Monty Python's Lumberjack song. The profits from the concert went to Harrison's charity, the Material World Charitable Foundation. In 2004, Harrison was posthumously inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame as a solo artist by his former bandmates Lynn and Petty, and into the Madison Square Garden Walk of Fame in 2006 for the concert for Bangladesh. On April 14, 2009, the Hollywood Chamber of Commerce awarded Harrison a star on the Walk of Fame in front of the Capitol Records building. McCartney, Lynn, and Petty were present when the star was unveiled. Harrison's widow Olivia, the actor Tom Hanks and Idol made speeches at the ceremony, and Harrison's son Dhani spoke the Hare Krishna mantra. A documentary film titled George Harrison, Living in the Material World, directed by Martin Scorsese, was released in October 2011. The film features interviews with Olivia and Dhani Harrison, Klaus Voormann, Terry Gilliam, Starr, Clapton, McCartney, Keltner and Astrid Kircher. Harrison was posthumously honored with the Recording Academy's Grammy Lifetime Achievement Award at the Grammy Awards in February 2015. Discography: Wonderwall Music, Electronic Sound, All Things Must Pass, Living in the Material World, Dark Horse, Extra Texture, 33 1/3, George Harrison, Somewhere in England, Gone Troppo, Cloud 9, Brainwashed. See also: List of peace activists. Explanatory notes. References. Citations.